poor corners of a city swollen with the bustle of the 19th century, there lived a man in a basement, in his own misery, apart from the teeming life above. This man, known to us as the underground man, lives not only in a physical basement, but in the metaphorical depths of society and his own psyche. His story unfolds in a series of stark revelations and confrontations with a world he can neither detach from nor fully engage with. This man, an enigmatic entity unto himself, embraced the solitude of his underground refuge, not out of necessity, but as a deliberate choice, a silent protest against the world above that moved in. Rhythms he scorned. I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. I am an unattractive man. I believe my liver is diseased. I know nothing about my disease, and I don't consult a doctor out of spite. His words are a manifesto of defiance against the unspoken rules that govern human existence. His disdain for the surface world was not born of a singular injustice, but from a deep-seated conviction that the very fabric of society was woven with hypocrisy and superficiality. To him, the bustling streets, the laughter of the carefree, and the solemn nods of the ambitious were but a grand masquerade. What can a decent man speak of with most pleasure? Of himself, he mused, turning inward to dissect the layers of his complex disdain for the world, and, paradoxically, his yearning for a place within it. His encounters with the beings of the outside world were fraught with a palpable tension, a clash not of swords but of wills and world views. One day, this man decides to take a walk out of the underground. Wandering about on a busy street, he crossed paths with an officer who, unaware of his being right in front, walked through him, moving him aside as an object, completely ignoring him as a person with no apology for doing so, only to infringe upon his physical space but also, and more significantly, on his fragile sense of dignity. This incident, seemingly trivial, vested in his mind, becoming a symbol of all he despised. The officer's act of dismissively moving him aside in the street, without acknowledgement, struck at the very core of the underground man's being. It was not just an act of physical displacement, but a profound dismissal of his existence. This slight became an obsession for him, a focus of deep-seated resentment and fantasies of revenge. He fantasized about challenging the officer to a duel or confronting him with a look that would sear his soul. Yet he does nothing. Each plan was abandoned, each imagined confrontation dissolving into the ether of his indecision and fear of further humiliation. His hatred for the officer was a mirror to his loathing of his own impotence and invisibility in a world that seemed to have no place for him. On an attempt to integrate, this underground man harbored a plan. From the life of self-imposed exile, he decided on one evening to emerge from his underground lair, not for a trivial matter, but to confront a past that haunted him as vividly as the specters of his present. He had learned of a dinner, a gathering of former classmates, men who had once shared the benches of academia with him, though they scarcely shared a word outside the hallowed halls. This dinner, ostensibly a celebration of their collective past, was for him an arena where he sought redemption and perhaps a perverse form of victory. His feelings toward these men were a maelstrom of envy, resentment, and a desperate need for acknowledgement. They were successful, each in their way, basking in the light of societal approval while he lingered in the shadows, nursing his grievances like cherished wounds. I was oppressed by the very fact of their being not in the least oppressed. His heart was a battleground where the desire for acceptance clashed with the impulse to deride and diminish those he envied. As he made his way to the dinner, his thoughts were a whirlwind of strategy and self-sabotage. He imagined confronting them, exposing the shallowness of their success and asserting his own superiority, the superiority of the intellect and spirit over mere social standing. Yet, beneath this veneer of defiance, there was a palpable longing for connection, for a moment of genuine recognition from those he viewed as both adversaries and arbiters of worth. The dinner unfolded in a manner that was at once predictable and excruciating for him. The pleasantries exchanged were as foreign to his disposition as the light of day to his accustomed gloom. He watched them with a critical eye, noting every display of arrogance, every burst of laughter that seemed to him a personal affront. They had made their way in life without me. They had got on somehow without me. These words tinged with bitterness and an undeniable sense of isolation. As the evening wore on, his attempts to assert himself, to disrupt the harmony of the gathering with his cynicism and provocations, only served to alienate him further. The more he sought to elevate himself, to force them to acknowledge his uniqueness, the more palpable his desperation became. I wanted to make them understand that they could not treat me as though I did not exist. His resolve mingled with despair as his efforts to provoke admiration or even hostility were met with indifference or mild amusement. The dinner, which he had envisioned as a battlefield where he would emerge either as victor or martyr, instead became a mirror reflecting his own inner turmoil. The contempt he felt for his classmates was in truth a reflection of his contempt for himself, for his inability to forge a path in the world, to be content with the simple pleasures and achievements that seemed to suffice for others. In the end, the man returned to his underground existence, no more acknowledged by his peers than before, yet irrevocably changed by the encounter. The dinner had not been a confrontation with his classmates so much as a confrontation with himself, with his insecurities, his delusions of grandeur, and the profound loneliness that lay at the heart of his disdain for the world. In the basement of his solitude, irritated by the failure of his previous plan and still longing for the warmth of human connection, the underground man found himself drawn to a place where the boundaries between acceptance and exploitation blur. It was not lust that guided his steps through the dimly lit streets to a house of ill repute, but a desperate need to affirm his existence to himself, if to no one else. Upon entering, he was met with the gaze of a young woman, a prostitute whose eyes seemed to reflect not just the flickering candlelight, but the myriad souls she had encountered in her line of work. In her gaze, he saw not judgment, but an unsettling depth of understanding, as if she could see through the armor of cynicism and intellectual superiority he had so carefully constructed around himself. His intentions were not those of a typical patron. He sought not the fleeting comfort of physical intimacy, but a connection of a different sort, a chance to prove to himself that beneath his contempt for society and its mores, he could still touch another human soul, could still offer solace and perhaps find redemption in the process. As they spoke, the man found himself laying bare his philosophy, his views on society, on love, and on the futility of existence. He spoke not to seduce, but to test, to see if his words could indeed bridge the chasm between their worlds. To love is to suffer, and there can be no love otherwise. His words were a challenge to the very notion of finding happiness in the embrace of another. The woman listened. In her, he found not the disdain or indifference he had come to expect from the world, but a kind of empathy, a recognition of the shared humanity that even his most fervent declarations of nihilism could not fully deny. In her presence, he felt a flicker of hope, a sense that perhaps he was not as alone in his suffering as he had believed. Yet, as the encounter unfolded, the man's inherent contradictions came to the fore. He oscillated between a desire to uplift her, to rescue her from her circumstances, and a darker impulse to assert his superiority, to prove that he was not like the others who frequented her quarters. He offered her money not for services rendered, but as a gesture of support, a way to empower her to change her life. The woman, touched by his words, saw in him not a savior, but a fellow lost soul, someone as trapped in his own cycles of self-loathing and despair as she was in hers, each marked by their own forms of suffering. This story comes from Fyodor Dostoevsky's novella, Notes from Underground, a masterful exploration of the human condition through the perspective of an individual at odds with society. The underground man is not just a character, but a philosophical inquiry into the nature of freedom, happiness, and the human soul's search for meaning. Through these encounters, the underground man's narrative becomes a labyrinth of self-reflection and societal critique. He sees himself too aware for his own good. This perception is rooted in a deep-seated belief that consciousness and acute self-awareness are curses, isolating him from the blissful ignorance of those around him. Dostoevsky exposes the illusion of superficial happiness that is particularly relevant in our modern era, marked by fleeting digital connections and the constant need of validation. He warns us against the allure of a happiness that is based on society's approval, suggesting instead that true fulfillment comes from embracing the complexity of the human condition with its imperfections. In a world increasingly dominated by the superficial, he advises us to find beauty in the depths, rather than just the surface. The story of the underground man becomes a call to action, to confront our own undergrounds, to question the foundations of our happiness, and to forge connections that are rooted in genuine understanding.